Right, so good afternoon, everybody. My name is Henrik Køhler, and before I start, I would like to introduce myself. I am an external lecturer at the Department of Management, Society and Communication at Copenhagen Business School. And I also work as a senior consultant offering consultancy services on business development and digitization. My paper today is based on selected parts from my MBA thesis, and I would also like to mention that a different and an early version of this paper in Danish has been accepted for publication by the Nordic Association for Lexicography. And before I start presenting my research questions and things like that, I would like to thank the reviewers for their very useful comments on the original submission. And I thank you for your time and your expertise. So when I did my MBA, I decided to research and analyze whether the lexicographic business model is working, or whether lexicography has a business model. And I would argue that this discussion is quite important, as the following slide will show. The discussion of the viability of the lexicographic product is crucial. And these clippings are from 5 leading Danish newspapers published 2-3 weeks ago. And it's a topical discussion going on in Denmark right now whether or not to close down what is referred to as the large Danish encyclopedia. This picture in the right-hand side of the slide is the CEO of Gyldendal, the biggest publishing company in Denmark. And what these headlines say in Danish is, well, that Gyldendal has decided to close down the large Danish encyclopedia, which apparently is being used by 100,000 users every day. They've decided to close it because it has been generating huge losses over the past 20 years. And at some point, Gyldendal actually decided to finance the reference work by means of advertisements. But this strategy also failed. Other publishing companies are right now trying to buy the large Danish encyclopedia because they believe that they have a better business model. So this is a typical and very important case in point, I would argue. I would also argue that conventional dictionaries seem to have overexploited the current business model, and for too long they seem to have had a disproportionate relation between the exploration of possibilities and the exploitation of old certainties, in the words of March 1991. In other words, lexicography seems to be in need of a new business model, which is viable and geared for the future. And I argue that we must start defining new ways of creating value. Because in the social age, functional value is not enough. So my presentation is about the business model of lexicography. So let's briefly take a look at the research questions, the methodology, and the empirical basis. But before we do that, I would like to ask you a few questions. Now, by raise of hands, how many of you work with business development? Right. How many of you have a business model? And I'm not advocating Osterwalder and Pigneur's theory, and I don't get percentages or anything like that. But how many of you know Osterwalder and Pigneur's value proposition canvas and their business model canvas? By raise of hands. 1, 2, 3, 4. Thank you so much. So, by raise of hands, I can conclude that obviously we need to talk about business models. But the objectives of my article were to analyze and discuss lexicographic business models in Denmark, and to analyze and discuss the following 3 research questions, as will appear from this slide. So let's briefly take a look at the empirical basis. This figure illustrates the structural approach of this article. I've used what you might call a kaleidoscopic approach, and I've applied 5 theoretical lenses to the discussion of business models. And what I did was for this paper, I selected 15, or I performed 15 interviews with CEOs or senior executives from primarily, yes? Pardon? Right, okay. But I will definitely go into that later. But what we have here is 5 lenses: core competencies, innovation, business understanding, organizational inertia, and strategy. So by means of these 5 lenses, thank you, sir, I've analyzed the concept of business models. So what I did was I interviewed 15 CEOs, including 2 international CEOs, which are not part of my discussion today, I would like to add. The overall philosophy of science that I've used is obviously social constructivist, because I want to understand their construction of the reality, if you like. And I've used Qualis' 7 stages of investigations. So let's take a look at some of the data that the interviews produced. And well, first, this slide shows a non-exhaustive list of the theoretical models and theoretical considerations that I've included. And they also include the 5 lenses that were depicted on the previous slide. So on the basis of the 15 interviews, or 13 interviews, I would like to argue or conclude that the Danish lexicographic industry seems neither to understand nor use the concept of business model. I know it's really provocative. It's a provocative argument to make that none of them actually understand business models. But I would again argue that that's the case. In fact, only 1 or 2 of the interviewed CEOs indicate that they actively use business model generation. And here we see 2 statements typical of the vast majority of interviewed persons interviewed, which is thought-provoking. In contrast to what we just saw, this slide shows 2 statements from CEOs whose companies actually use a business model. And it's important to remember that Denmark is a very small country. We only are 5.75 million Danish speakers. And Denmark is a very small language area. So that obviously is important to remember in this discussion. It would probably have produced other results had this interview session been conducted in the UK, in France, in Germany, or in other countries, obviously. So let's briefly take a look at what the interview persons, said about the 5 lenses. So let's take a look at the first lens. When looking through business models through the lens of strategy, it seems again as if there has been a lack of strategic planning and execution in the vast majority of the surveyed case organizations. And this is one statement by one of the CEOs. And actually, this was one of the CEOs who did have a clear digital strategy. He said, "We decided on a clear digital strategy and started to contact our customers directly, and it worked." So we take a look at the core competencies, originally defined by Hamel and Prahalad. Again, I could conclude that the large majority of the 15 companies that I've surveyed had little strategic direction in their treatment of core competencies. Again, this is one statement by the same CEO we saw on the previous slide, because they had a clear strategic decision. So obviously it has impact on the employee turnover, because they switched their editors, or they laid off the editors and hired digital experts, software experts. So let's take a look at the third lens, innovation. One CEO said, and that was actually from one of the very successful companies, he said when asked about strategic innovation, well, there has been too little innovation and too little focus on the customers. I think we should have acted quicker. So again, I would argue that when applying the lens of strategic innovation on the interview data, it seems as if we have had a very limited active approach to innovation in the industry. And the last and a bit more fussy lens, I agree, is what you might refer to as business understanding. Again, this is actually a statement by one of the CEOs from one of the quite successful companies. He said, well, we started actually trying to cold canvas, if you like, the Ministry of Education, and suddenly we were allowed to use digital dictionaries at the exam in public schools. So, this, in my view, is a brilliant example of a CEO who has a plan, and also that he has ample understanding of how the business works and how the value chain of that particular industry works. So let's move on to organizational inertia, and that would be the last lens. So I would, again, based on the interview data, argue that a lot of the companies have in fact suffered from negative organizational inertia. Negative organizational inertia are discussed by a number of theoretical experts, but it is, in essence, we keep doing the same thing. One CEO, in fact, reflected on this and said as follows: and in that process, we've been disrupted because we thought things would not change. So, these insights enabled me to discuss the last two research questions, and I would now like to offer you a few considerations on some of the other issues dealt with in my paper. So, obviously, we are dealing with a number of different business models. First of all, it's important for me to underline that we can't talk about one-size-fits-all business model. A business model is must be tailor-made to the customers, to the products, and to the company in question. But obviously, we can use tools like Osterwalder and Pigneu's value proposition map or business model canvas if we want to use a structured approach to our business modeling. So, before we start working on an example of a business model, I think we need to talk about the business aspects of lexicography. And I would argue, in line with Milton, I think, or was it Drucker, that the business of lexicography is business. It's not politics. It's business. So, and I've been working in this field since 1999, and I in fact argue that the business, as I said, of lexicography is business. So we need to talk about the business model. Commercial lexicography is business. Publicly funded lexicography is business. It's just two different business models. And obviously, I argue that lexicographic companies or organizations can make 4 different decisions, as you will see in the slide. And by the way, I've been inspired by Ansof's growth matrix. So, sometimes we need to consider questions like, should I stay or should I go? To use a reference to Kahneman's 2013 article from Frank Zappa. This is Clash, I know, the Clash. So sometimes we actually need to discuss, should I stay or should I go? Or sometimes we need to go. Sometimes we need to close down business and migrate into another business. Because rational business decisions sometimes mean that you have to discontinue the business that you're in to limit losses. And you might argue that this was what they didn't do at Gyldendal. They kept on spending money for 20 years on a reference work that generated losses. Right? So sometimes you should actually leave the scene. So let's take a look at Osterwalder and Pigneur. This is the value proposition canvas, and I only got 4 minutes left, so I'll just rush through the value proposition canvas. You can take a look at the article and see some of the arguments that I've made. Again, I would like to underline that this is not a one-size solution, one-size-fits-all. But I actually also think that we should talk about what value is in the social age. And Drucker has put it as follows. What the customer buys and considers a value is never a product. It's always a utility that is what a product does for him. And actually it resembles Wiegand's genuiner Zweck, right? And actually you can talk about emotional benefits and functional benefits. And perhaps we have for too long been talking about functional benefits and not enough emotional benefits. And this is what this particular model actually helps us with, to depict what the customer is and our offerings on the left-hand side in the value map. And this is the value proposition canvas that can help us create an effective value proposition. Yeah. Once we've defined the value proposition, we can go on talking about the business model. This slide shows what might be described as a very general proposal for a lexicographic business model. And as will appear, I've listed a number of ideas in each of the 9 fields. I'll only focus on 2 of these fields today. This is the value proposition. So, for example, in line with the first speaker today, she talked about Industry 4.0. If, for example, our value proposition would be that we would like to help people communicate with robots and artificial intelligence, then we would definitely need to redesign what we do as lexicographers or data experts. We would definitely also have to talk about the revenue streams, because as we saw in the slides from Denmark, advertisements do not work in a small country area like that. So we need other solutions. And this business model canvas and the value proposition canvas are actually quite useful when discussing or generating new business models, also in lexicography. So that's why I came up with these 6 theses on new lexicographic business models. I've elaborated them in detail in my paper, and in conclusion, I would like to ask you one final question. So, in your mind, does it make sense to talk about business models in lexicography? By raise of hands, and I hope to see a lot of hands. Does it make sense? Hopefully it does. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much, and I welcome questions and critical remarks.
Thank you, Henrik, for this inspiring talk. Yeah, thanks. I'd just like to understand what happened in Denmark a bit more clearly. You were saying that there was as it were, a new competitor came into the market and was disruptive and took over a big part of Gyldendal's market share. And you were saying they had an inferior product, but I'm intrigued by inferior in content, but there must have been something good about it in terms of being appealing or flashy or in some way attractive that enabled it to do that. So did you mean that the actual lexical content was less good?
A brilliant question, and I'm very pleased that you asked, because this is actually what what I'm trying to argue. What this competitor did was actually shift focus from the lexicographic data to the distribution platform. And again, when you talk about new customers or Generation Y, they don't care about lexicographic data. They care about distribution platforms. They care about design. They care about wrapping. So, actually, their lexicographic data were inferior to the to the company at that point, but they won the market because their distribution platform was superior. And that's what happened, more or less.
Yeah, I was afraid you would say that.
Obviously, and I'm not saying that lexicographic data are not important. They are, obviously. I'm a lexicographer, right? But we also need to understand that the business model of lexicography is important, that the distribution platforms, that the market analysis and the customer analysis should be in order, right?
Very quick question. How many of those 15 CEOs were women? Probably won't work, just shout.
4.
What?
So you didn't give the opportunity to raise your hand saying, no, I don't think that a business model is important in lexicography. But what if your market, in quotes, is only the first two of the top two that you had, students and basically the public interest. You've written off all of Africa, you've written off Albania, you've written off more than half the people in the world as eligible for lexicographic data and for dictionaries.
No, I'm not. I'm just underlining the fact that whatever you do, you need to have a plan, and you need to have a business model that works for you. And I would argue that even though you do publish dictionaries in Albania, for example, you must have a business model. I'm not talking about generating revenue from customers. I'm actually talking about the revenue streams that you get from a variety of investors. For example, the government or funds or things like that. So no, I actually think it applies to a lot of areas, I would argue.
So where is, for Albanian, for example, how would you propose a business model? If basically, how would you propose a business model for a library in Albania? If it's a public service, the model is someone funds it and somebody else uses it.
I would definitely be an arrogant idiot if I started giving solution to that right now. That would I would have to analyze the market. I would have to analyze the revenue streams. I would have to analyze the technology, maturity, and things like that before even attempting to answer that question. Thank you.